Before I bring on Jonathan, we'll hear from Barbara Smith, the Carter Center's Vice President for Peace Programs, who oversees the center's remarkable work across the world on democracy, human rights, conflict resolutions, and rule of law programs. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Barbara Smith.
Thank you, Mark. It is so great to be here, and thanks to the LBJ Foundation for co-hosting this event. The Carter Center has been co-hosting events like this with our friends around the world to honor President Carter, and it's just been incredible to see the outpouring of love for President Carter and the celebration of his life and achievements. This is also a homecoming of sorts for me to be back here. I am a Texan and a graduate of University of Texas at Austin, so it's good to be home. Hook 'em horns. And but I'm here to talk about the Carter Center. Just very briefly, the Carter Center was a labor of love for President Carter. It was founded in 1982 to advance his vision of waging peace, fighting disease, and building hope. And the Carter Center has been doing that since that time through a number of programs, the kind that Mark mentioned, of course, but also our incredible health programs that work to fight neglected and eliminate and eradicate neglected tropical diseases, to include guinea worm eradication, which we took the lead on in 1986 when there were something like 3.5 million cases annually. And in 2023, I am excited to be able to say that number has come down to just 14 cases annually. So super incredible numbers. Thank you. And one of the other things, of course, that was very near and dear to President Carter's heart was our work on human rights and on democracy, advancing democracy around the world. And in fact, President Carter led many of our 125 election observation missions that took place to date in some 40 countries around the world. So also another incredible achievement by the Carter Center and President Carter. In addition to that, in his work with human rights, I did want to single out his incredible work on gender equality and gender equity, to include programs like our Inform Women, Transform Lives program, which is now active in dozens of countries around the world. So the impact of the programs is felt, far and wide around the world, but it's not over. President Carter, because of President and Mrs. Carter and the work and the dedication that they have, the Carter Center is well positioned to continue the work for decades to come. The President Carter's vision is being advanced by some 3,500 staff that we have around the world. And that doesn't even include the incredible partners that we have in the countries in which we work. So we will strive to continue this work. And hopefully we'll be able to make President Carter proud and honor his legacy, to truly meet the moment and to hold to those principles that he has held so dear. So on behalf of the executive team of the Carter Center, I just wanted to say thank you again for sharing this evening with us. Thank you to Jonathan Alter and Mark Updegrove. Jonathan, you should know that your book is widely read at the Carter Center. You have lots of fans there. And so with that, I'd love to welcome both Jonathan and Mark back to the stage. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Barbara. Thank you so much for that. Really nice of you to say.
Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody for coming. I'm really thrilled to be here. I've been here before, of course, but this is just such a great occasion. And I just wanted to quickly say that I'm honored that Lucy Johnson and her husband, Ian Turpin, are here tonight.
Lucy Johnson, who attended the Carter Memorial Service at the National Cathedral last week. Well, congratulations on his very best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. It's a remarkable read. I want to quote you from the book, Jonathan, in which you write, Jimmy Carter was a surprisingly consequential president, a political and stylistic failure, but a substantive and far-sighted success. And in the end, I concluded that his presidency is underrated and that his post-presidency, while path-breaking and inspiring, offered him fewer levers for change and was marred at times by his ego and thus a bit overrated. That sort of bucks the conventional wisdom about Jimmy Carter's life and legacy. And I want to delve into both of those things. But before we talk about his presidency and his post-presidency, let's talk about his formative years. Jimmy Carter grew up in his beloved Plains and Archery, Georgia, and it seemed to inform his life in so many ways. How did growing up in Archery and Plains shape the life of Jimmy Carter?
So, I like to think of Jimmy Carter as the only figure who lived in 3 centuries effectively. So he was born in 1924, no running water, no electricity, no mechanized farm equipment, basic barefoot for most of the year except when he would go to school in Plains. And then he would, his father was this kind of serial entrepreneur, and he overmade women's shoes one year, and he made his son Jimmy wear the women's shoes, high button, turn of the century women's shoes to school. So that had an effect on him. So, basically born in the 19th century. Then he's not just president, but involved in all of the major movements to one degree or another of the 20th century. And then, as we just heard, involved in all the cutting edge issues of the 21st century, conflict resolution, global health, democracy promotion. So this is an epic American life. But what really fascinated me was just understanding what it meant to grow up under Jim Crow segregation and how, there's really no other word for it, how mean it was in Southwest Georgia. But Carter had this very unusual upbringing in that his father, who taught him hard work and a number of his other discipline, many other values that Carter carried forward came from his father. But he was not just a segregationist, but a white supremacist. Like no black people could come in the front door of their house. And yet his mother, Ms. Lillian, who people might remember from the Carter presidency, she'd go on Johnny Carson, and she was really funny. And she was the only person in Sumter County who had anything nice to say about Abraham Lincoln. And she treated black patients for free. She was a nurse. And they had a third parent. Jimmy had a third parent, effectively, a woman named Rachel Clark, an illiterate black farmhand whose husband was the foreman, who some of you might have seen in the live coverage of the days leading up to the funeral. They passed his boyhood home and they rang the bell 39 times because he was the 39th president. Well, Rachel Clark's husband rang that bell an hour before daylight every day. Jimmy Carter got up an hour before daylight and started very hard work on the farm. And Rachel Clark taught him his love of nature. He grew up to be our greatest environmental president, with the exception of Theodore Roosevelt. And much of his faith came from his conversations with Rachel Clark. So then he's able to transcend this this upbringing, and that really starts at the Naval Academy in the early 1940s. But he's surrounded by, I think the easiest way to think of it is until Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the United States was not a democracy. Right. I mean, you had in the South, and black folks had a hard enough time in the North, but in the South, you would have majority black counties where you could count the number of black voters on one hand. And this was the world that Carter grew up in, and it's part of what makes his story so epic.
The other thing, it strikes me, John, is he grows up in Archery. Archery is 2 miles west of Plains. It's now incorporated, I believe, into the Plains Township. Yeah. But at the time, it was its own municipality. But they're the only white family among 50-some black families. So Jimmy Carter literally grows up immersed in black culture in a way. And when he was on this stage, he talked about that as being all his best friends were young men of color.
Yeah, and especially A.D. Davis, who Carter later got out of prison many years later. So he was his best friend growing up, and they did everything together. They wrestled and played baseball and fished until A.D. was about 12. And then one day they're kind of roughhousing and racing around, and there was a gate that separated by the way, it's a national park site. You can go and see this just outside Plains. I recommend it. Was a pasture gate, and A.D. opens the gate, and Jimmy thinks, is there some sort of booby trap on here? Am I, what kind of practical joke is he playing? But he was raised by his aunt and uncle, and they told him, look, he's Mr. Jimmy now, and you've got to open the gate for him. And Carter later wrote a poem about that after he left the presidency. It's actually quite a good poem called The Pasture Gate. And the way they resolved it was that A.D. said, I know that I can't go in the house anymore because he had reached an age where Jimmy's father wouldn't let him in the house except in the back, in the kitchen if he was doing some chore or something. But I'm not going to call you Mr. Jimmy. And Jimmy said, I don't want you to call me Mr. Jimmy.
He eventually, we've got 100 years to cover and about an hour to do it.
Sorry.
No.
I'm being a little long-winded
I'm not
here.
speeding you along.
Yeah, no,
but
you can tell I'm a little obsessed on this topic, right?
But I want to go along to, we'll come back to Plains in a moment, because Jimmy Carter embarks on let me, before I do that, let me talk about Rosalind Carter.
Yeah.
He meets Rosalind Carter really for the first time, for all practical purposes, in 1945, when he's back from the Naval Academy. She is a Plains native. They go on a date. Jimmy Carter goes back and tells his mom, I've met the woman I'm going to marry. And they marry in 1946 and have a marriage that lasts 77 years.
Yeah.
Talk about that relationship. What characterizes that incredibly strong partnership between Jimmy and Rosalind Carter?
So I just want to back up a little bit to 1927, the year that Rosalind was born, same year my mother was born. And so I mentioned Ms. Lillian is a nurse. So she delivers Rosalind Smith. And Jimmy was 2.5, and a couple days after the new baby was born, Ms. Lillian brings her toddler around to the Smith house to see the new baby. And Rosalind then became best friends with Jimmy's sister, Ruth. Yeah. So he knew her as his younger sister's friend, and they knew each other for 97 years. And they were married for 77, and my wife and I went down for their 75th wedding anniversary in Plains, and it was, very different from other kinds of events that former presidents had. Most of them were their local friends. I mean, Nancy Pelosi came. To the shock of everybody, the Clintons came because the Clintons and the Carters had not gotten along. But I tried to research how many couples have been married for 75 years or longer, and there's so few they don't even have statistics, but they think it's fewer than 50 in the entire United States.
Wow.
And so, you know, I mean, this was an extraordinary partnership from the beginning. Rosalind wanted to get out of planes after they were married. She was really happy to be a Navy wife and very upset when Jimmy quit the nuclear Navy. He was working for Admiral Rickover on the most exciting technological project of the middle part of the 20th century, where they were putting a nuclear power plant on a submarine before they were on land. And Colin Powell said this is what won the Cold War for the United States, because our subs could stay under water much longer than the Soviet subs. So she was so unhappy when he didn't consult her before going home after his father died to assume his father's business and civic responsibilities. She gave him the silent treatment all the way home, and she'd say, "Jack, tell your father we need to go to a rest stop," you know. And so she was an enormously formidable woman, and one of the great pleasures of my project was getting to know her. And when my book came out, her reaction was I was told by somebody who heard this from her, Jonathan had some very critical things to say about Jimmy, but he only said nice things about me. And that was true, because so often the wife of a president, this was not true of Lady Bird Johnson, but it has been true of many first ladies. The staff, the president's staff, resents them because they're interfering, and you know, the president's staff loved Rosalind because she had better political judgment than her husband, and she was also into all kinds of extraordinary things. I mean, she was responsible for the first mental health legislation we've ever had in this country. She and Betty Bumpers, the wife of Dale Bumpers, are responsible for states requiring vaccination before you can go to school, which, imagine how much chickenpox and measles and the rest that prevented in this country. She was there was a lot of criticism because she sat in on cabinet meetings, and the press didn't like that. But she was his single most influential advisor. And I would argue that if you judge the influence of a first lady by how much influence they had on her husband, that she was the most influential first lady in American history.
She resists, as you suggested earlier, going back to planes in 1953 after Jimmy Carter's father dies. Why does Carter want to go back?
So this was the big, difficult decision of his life. Basically, he felt that the town would have died. His father was a successful merchant. I mean, I mentioned that they had no running water until he was 11 years old, but they were well-to-do by local standards. And when he got back, when his father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 1953, and then his brother Billy and both of his sisters later died of pancreatic cancer. He was the only one who did not. He realized all of these people, black and white, were coming to him, and he was like canceling their debts, and they were bringing him food. And this father, who he had a fraught relationship with over race, they had quarreled and been estranged over race when Carter was in the Navy, that it was more complicated than that, his relationships with people. And when he went to his father's funeral, which, by the way, was the only time that, at the family's insistence, that black people were allowed into Plains Baptist Church, and Carter later quit the church and started a new church because as late as the 70s when he's president, they still wouldn't integrate the church. And he realizes the church is jammed, and he realizes, if I died, would anybody come to my funeral? What have I done for other people? You know, I'm a naval officer. Great, that's great for me. What have I done and for my community? So he was partly motivated by the fact the business was bankrupt, and he had, with Rosalind's help, he had to rescue Carter's warehouse, which was their main holding. And he went on to be a millionaire by the time he was president. But he was partly motivated by this sort of sense that he just had to lead a more meaningful life. And he went home and he assumed all of his father's civic responsibilities, and eventually times 10. And he was involved in, you know, I could bore you with all of his civic activities before politics.
So since that flows, that humanitarianism flows through his life, that love for fellow man, that desire, that fierce desire to give back, where does that come from?
His faith. You know, it's all rooted in his faith. And it's not very well known, but, well, first of all, he started teaching Sunday school when he was at the Naval Academy. But he had ups and downs, and then he had a kind of a slow born-again experience that his sister, who was a kind of New Age evangelist, his sister Ruth, his other sister, Gloria, was the den mother for the Hells Angels. And her tombstone says she rides in Harley Heaven now. So when Carter started running for president, Billy, who everybody remembers, Billy Beer, who ran the gas station, he said, you know, I got one sister who's a holy roller. I got another who rides with the Hells Angels. My brother thinks he's going to be president of the United States. I'm the only normal one in the whole damn family. But he had this kind of crisis of faith after he lost for governor the first time. And he has a born-again experience that is much shaped by going door to door for Jesus in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania for a few weeks, and has a variety of experiences that I think most of them are in my book for the first time, like the love letters between Jimmy and Rosalind from the Navy are in the book for the first time. Rosalind gave them to me. And I was really struck at that period, that was 1968 when he was doing this, that he made a decision that he was going to run again for governor, and that he thought of, and he said this explicitly at the time, and then many decades later, I revisited this in our conversation, that if you have constituents, that's a much bigger congregation than you could have if you went into the ministry. So a senior Baptist minister in Georgia said, you know, you should go to divinity school. You'd be fantastic. And he said, I'm going to go into politics instead because I can help more people that way.
So he loses the gubernatorial bid in 1966. Right. He renews, he doubles down on his Christian faith, runs again in 1970, wins, winds up on the cover of Time magazine shortly thereafter, after having proclaimed in his gubernatorial inauguration address, I say to you frankly that the time for racial segregation is over. He ushers in this new age in the South, the New South. Yeah. So what happens in those 4 years to Jimmy Carter that he thinks he can run for the presidency afterward?
Well, first, just to tell a quick story about that inaugural address that you just mentioned. So Carter ran to the right in 1970. He was running against the former governor, Carl Sanders from Atlanta, and Carter represented the rural conservative areas of Georgia in the Georgia State Senate. And the only way for him to win that primary was to run to the right. And at one point, and he said nice things about George Wallace, who he privately despised, And he didn't say anything racist, but he sort of, there were some dog whistles or code words. And I was questioning about it very closely, and he nicely, and sometimes he could be a little snappish, but he nicely said, "Are we done talking about this yet?" And I said, "President Carter, not yet," because this was the low point, I would argue, of his whole career, and he feels that way too. In the last day of the campaign, he was being flown around the state by an eccentric businessman named David Rabhan, looked like Kojak with the blue jumpsuit. And later when Carter was president, he was taken prisoner in Iran, and Carter, after he left, worked with the Ayatollah. This again is a story nobody knows, to get this guy out of prison, in addition to all the hostages that everybody knows about. So Carter says, "David, you've done so much for me in this campaign, flying me all around the state." It got him elected. It's a big state, not as big as Texas, but it's big. "Is there anything I can do for you?" And Rabhan takes out a flight map, the only thing to write on, and he writes, "The time for racial discrimination is over. Sign this and say it in your inaugural address." And Carter does. And he had met Daddy King during the campaign, because Rabhan, this pilot businessman, was close to the King family. But Daddy King was for his opponent. But then after he says this, the whites walk out, his white colleagues, they walk out of his inauguration. You wouldn't think it would be that big of a deal, but the time for racial discrimination is over. They walk out. The black attendees he said, "What?" They couldn't believe it. And I argue, Carter was almost 50 at that point, and I argue that he spent the second half of his life making up for what he did not do in the first half, that is, standing up for civil rights. And at one point he said to me, "I never claimed to be part of the civil rights movement." After George Floyd was killed, he issued a statement that was along the lines of, like, "We all can do more, and better late than never. It's never too late to do the right thing." So I think he was kind of powered by this as governor. He integrated Georgia state government, appointed the first black judges, and then when the candidates for 1972 would come by and stay in the governor's mansion, all of them, Kennedy, Humphrey, all the rest of them, Carter thought, as a governor, I know more than these senators about the way government really works. And he thought he was smarter than a lot of them. So he said, "I can do this." And on the night that Nixon was reelected in 72, he decided he was going to go for it in 76. And because he couldn't run for reelection, and he made so many tough decisions as governor, that he told me he would have been defeated for re-election the way he was for president if he'd ran again. Because he'd always decide what he thought was, not always, but most of the time, what he thought was the right thing to do, not the politically popular thing to do. And he suffered badly, as we know, for doing that. So he left the governorship and he was unemployed. So he had a big advantage in the Iowa caucuses. But when he first said he was going to run for president, his mother said, "President of what?" You know, that's how unknown he was. He had been on the cover of Time, but he was at literally 0% in the polls. So he went to New York. He went on What's My Line? Remember that show? They couldn't figure out who he was. He danced with the Rockettes. Like there's a picture of him in my book with high kicking with anything to get publicity, to get on the map. And then he ran this brilliant campaign because even though he, had his political challenges as a communicator in small groups, retail politics, he was a great candidate, and he came out of nowhere and beat all these better-known candidates to win.
So let me. And you put it in interesting context. There was a one-term limit on the governorship in Georgia, and that worked to his advantage.
Yes.
He would not have been able to gain the presidency had he run for re-election as governor.
Yeah.
So he probably wouldn't have been a successful candidate for the presidency. Let's hear from President Carter himself as he talks about that race in 1976.
There was a stigma on the Deep South that was very deep because Lyndon Johnson became president and because he passed the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it liberated me to overcome that stigma, potentially. And I saw that as an opening, a very small opening, that I might fill. So I began to campaign when I left the governor's mansion. And I didn't have any money. And almost all of the Democratic Party leaders, I don't know of any exceptions, were for some of the 9 or 10 candidates running against me, including Lloyd Bentsen from Texas, as you remember. And so I didn't have much of a chance. I campaigned by myself with just one assistant, Jody Powell, who later became my press secretary. We never stayed in a hotel or motel. We couldn't afford it. None of the people that worked for me in the campaign were permitted to stay in a motel unless they paid their own way. And when we went into a town, we would try to find somebody to let us spend a night with them. And I would have to stay up all night listening to their stories or questions. But we made an impact, and so when we left, they supported us. So I was kind of, I hate to say this in a way, but I was kind of like the Tea Party has been the last year. Because the people that supported me were so fed up with Washington that they were looking for somebody to represent non-Washington politics.
I didn't stand a chance. And this is an incredible campaign. This guy, this man is literally sleeping on couches a year before he's in the White House. It's an amazing, so put that race in context. How did this guy from the Deep South, who had little chance of winning the presidency, ultimately not only win the nomination, but wrest the presidency from the incumbent Gerald Ford?
Well, it really is rooted in Vietnam and Watergate. So he makes reference to this, how fed up people were with the government, and it's very reminiscent of today, I think more so than the Tea Party. And people had lost faith in our institutions, and they were ready for a breath of fresh air from the outside. Now, we could talk, I've written a lot about how, Carter was the un-Trump in so many ways. Carter promised to never tell a lie, and he didn't lie. He he exaggerated sometimes, but he didn't lie. He introduced most of our ethics legislation, which Trump is now planning to ignore. But the impulse of somebody, but instead of like a middle finger to the system, which I think is part of what's going on in our politics right now, it was a much more hopeful message. It was, we need a government as good as our people. So there was like a moral imperative, and he initially wasn't eager to talk about his faith, but eventually that did become part of the campaign. And I mentioned Wallace earlier, who he had said nice things about in 1970. In 1976, Wallace, who had been wounded in an assassination attempt in 72, was running again. People forget that Wallace ran 3 times for president, 68, 72, and 76. And when Carter beat him in the Florida primary, that was the end of the racist wing of the Democratic Party. And so this was a hugely important thing, kind of long-term, for the Democratic Party. And then Carter became the symbol of the New South. And there was a lot of pride when he was first elected, Southern pride. He was the first Southerner elected since Zachary Taylor in 1848. But then, for reasons we can discuss, 4 years later, the South went for Reagan. Mostly.
So I just want to lift up your book cover. This is an Andy Warhol portrait of Jimmy Carter. Yeah. There was a time when Jimmy Carter, this is hard to believe, but there was a time when Jimmy Carter was cool.
Yeah.
Right?
He is again now, by the way.
Right.
He's very cool now.
But you write about his coming into the presidency. Not since John F. Kennedy took office 16 years before had Washington felt the electric charge of something new in American life. There was a spark in Washington and in the country and a great hope around the Carter presidency. Talk about how he enters the presidency and what happens in that first year.
So the first thing that happened was he gets out of the car and he walks down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. And I was a college student, and I just thought of this the other day because I walked past the Russell Senate office building after I had been in the Capitol Rotunda. People waited for 5 hours in the cold last week, and I was very inspired by this, and because there were so many young people there, and this really filled me with hope. But I remembered when I was young, when I was in front of the Russell Senate office building, on January 20th, 1977, I was at that corner, and I heard passing through the crowd, it was way before cell phones, Carter got out of the car. He got out of the car, he's walking. People couldn't believe it, right? And he was the first one to do that. It's now been done by others. And so there was this spirit of freshness and possibility. And he actually was more popular in his first year than Reagan ever got. Yeah. Higher than Reagan ever got at his peak. But he quickly got bogged down in often problems with other Democrats. And he, at one point, I said, what was your biggest mistake? And he said, I didn't do a good enough job managing my relationships within the Democratic Party. Yeah. And so pretty quickly, this started to wear him down. And I think part of it, and one former congressman said this explicitly to me, the previous Democratic president had been Lyndon Johnson with this gargantuan legislative record. And so when Carter is having trouble with his tax bill, his welfare bill, he's quarreling with Kennedy about health care, even though he's getting 70% of his program through, and really big things, 15 major pieces of environmental legislation. And we can talk about, the domestic agenda and how trucking deregulation gave us, FedEx and Amazon, and none of this would have been possible without a number of deregulatory decisions he made on economic but not health and safety issues. We could talk about his domestic agenda, but the point is it wasn't good enough for liberals. Yeah. And so they then went with Ted Kennedy for this challenge. And so the freshness wore off, and then in the second half of his presidency, he was swamped by events, basically, that weren't his fault, but that cost him dearly.
In 1978, Jimmy Carter brings Menachem Begin, the prime minister of Israel, and Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, to Camp David. And I want to talk about that, and I want to quote you from the book. But first, I'll play a clip from Jimmy Carter, who talks about that final day, day 13th at Camp David, when it looks like Menachem Begin is going to walk from the peace talks that he is so stridently and so diligently put together. And he's this close, but it's about to go off the rails.
The last day was a turning point because we thought we had failed. And we were getting ready to leave Camp David in failure and go back to Washington and announce that we had not been successful. And Prime Minister Begin asked me if I would sign a photograph for his 8 grandchildren of me and Begin and Sadat. And I agreed to do it. And my secretary, whose name was Susan Clow, got the names of Begin's 8 grandchildren from Israel. She called over there and got their names. So instead of saying best wishes, Jimmy Carter, I said with love and best wishes to, and I put down his grandchild's name, and I signed it. And I took it over to his cabin to tell him goodbye. And when he opened the door, he was very angry with me. And he said, "Good afternoon, Mr. President." He was always very proper. And I said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Prime Minister, and I'm sorry we hadn't been successful. I brought the photographs you asked for," and I gave the photographs to him. And he turned around and said, "Thank you, sir." And then he looked down at the photographs, and he read out loud, "Love and best wishes to," and said, he read his grandchild's name. And he put that over in the back, and he read the next one's name. And he read the third one's name, and his chin began to quiver, and tears ran down his cheeks, and mine too. And he said, in effect, "Why don't we try one more time?"
This is a remarkable testament to Carter's tenacity, his preternatural confidence in himself, and his fierce desire to make peace. I want to quote you from the book. You say, "The Camp David Accords and the treaty that resulted did more than save tens of thousands of Egyptian and Israeli lives. They dramatically reduced the odds of a general war, even superpower confrontation in the Middle East." And you continue to say that his handiwork has remained remarkably intact, making it the most important and durable peace treaty anywhere in the world since World War II. That, as they would say in the Deep South, is high cotton. Put that accomplishment in context. John.
Well, just think, all the problems that we have in the Middle East today. Imagine if on top of that, Israel and Egypt were fighting what would be the fifth war. I mean, before at Camp David, these Israelis and Egyptians who were just in cabins right near each other, just a few years earlier in 1973, they'd been literally killing each other. Many of them had relatives who died in either 48, 56, 67, or 73. That's a lot of war between two countries. And the Egyptian army, to this day, is the only army with the capacity to actually destroy Israel. So the fact that they've had this chilly but nonetheless durable peace since 1978 means that Jimmy Carter, for all the criticism of him from the American Jewish community, which believes rightly that he's the most pro-Palestinian president there's ever been, for all that criticism, Carter did more for the security of the state of Israel than any president since Harry Truman recognized Israel in 1948. And the details of this personal diplomacy, which are unparalleled in our history. Theodore Roosevelt won a Nobel Prize for settling the Russo-Japanese War, but he didn't even go to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He did it from afar. Other presidents, for good reason, don't get personally involved, because when there's failure, then they get blamed. So he took a huge risk in doing this, and they went through more than 20 drafts. And he was often criticized, too much attention to detail. Well, that's what gave us that. That's what gave us the Alaska Lands Bill, which doubled the size of the national park system. That's arguably what gave us the Panama Canal treaties, which prevented a major war in Central America. And his other, achievements were the flip side of this engineering attention to detail. But just one other thing about Camp David. So after they came back from Camp David, and Begin and Sadat both said this should be the Jimmy Carter Conference, the deal fell apart. This could happen with the deal in Gaza now. These things have a way of sometimes falling apart. And it looked like it had all unraveled in late 1978 and early 1979. In March of 79, Carter goes to Israel and Egypt, and he puts the whole thing back together with baling wire and chewing gum, puts the deal back together. And his aide said, "Don't do this. It's not going to work. Camp David is dead. It was a nice try." But he insisted on it, and that, I think, is part of his greatness.
But the hope of that moment, so that the Camp David Accords get signed at the White House in 1979, but and it was an incredibly hopeful moment, not only in the United States, but in the world. But that glow doesn't last. The last couple of years of Carter's presidency are a slog for Carter and for the country. What happens?
Well, the Iranian Revolution, before we even get to the hostages, the Iranian oil fields went offline. So we had already experienced this horrendous inflation, started in the 60s under Johnson. Remember, war, can you have guns and butter? No, you're going to get inflation. And then after the 1973 Arab oil embargo, got a lot worse. Then the Iranian Revolution made it even worse. So we had double-digit inflation. Imagine, we'd just been through the first inflation since then. Imagine double-digit inflation. Then Carter appoints Paul Volcker, and Paul Volcker, as chair of the Fed, applies this very, very harsh medicine in the form of double-digit interest rates. They went as high as 19%. Imagine trying to buy a house or start a business, 19%, or buy a car, 19% interest rates. So these are major economic forces that are beyond his control, but he's understandably going to be blamed for. And then, so you have gas lines, because there are gas shortages, and his popularity goes way down. Then the hostages are seized on November 4th, 1979, and his numbers go up. There's a rally around the flag. He beats Ted Kennedy in the early primaries. Kennedy makes what I consider to be a big mistake against the advice of his brother-in-law, Steve Smith, who was his campaign manager. And he doesn't drop out after Iowa and New Hampshire. He fights him all the way to the convention, which really weakens Carter because he doesn't have a unified Democratic Party. The Iran hostage rescue mission fails. And then there are these efforts to try to get the hostages out in the fall in the general election. And there is a lot to be said for the idea, and it hasn't been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, but there's some new things that have come out that suggest that Bill Casey, Reagan's campaign manager, was in touch with the Iranians to delay the release of the hostages until after the election. I think even if the hostages had come home, Carter thinks if he just had another helicopter, he would have been reelected.
The failed Desert One mission.
Yeah, Desert
right.
One mission.
Right.
I think that even if they'd gotten the hostages out, the economy was so bad, Reagan was so much of a better communicator that Reagan would have won anyway, but it wouldn't have been a blowout. But it was like the world was caving in on him. Then boycotting the Olympics after the invasion of Afghanistan, the Soviet invasion, very popular at first, like almost unanimous support for that boycott in the Senate. But then as time went on, it became significantly unpopular.
Right. What happens? So again, with Carter, it's easy to canonize Jimmy Carter. He's a remarkable human talent.
He should not be canonized. He was a very complex person.
So how did the flaws in Jimmy Carter's nature lead to his failure in those last 2 years?
Well, at one point I looked at the logs of his calls with members of Congress. And unlike LBJ, and we can all hear that tapes of him talking to other politicians, Carter didn't think of himself as a politician.
Yeah.
And he was missing the schmooze gene. So these logs, the calls would be like 30 seconds, 45 seconds. He'd call up a member of Congress and say, vote with me on this, bye, And so there's one story, there's one story about the White House tennis courts, very famous story that's untrue, that he personally supervised who got to play on the White House tennis court. It turned out it was Susan Cloud, his secretary, who we mentioned, who put, JC, she'd forge his initials and signatures on a lot of pictures, which the autograph dealers should know about. But a true story about the tennis courts is his aide said, have some senators over to play tennis. I think one of them was Lloyd Benson, if I'm remembering right, who was a tennis player. And they played tennis. And then afterward, Carter left the court and said, good to see you, bye-bye. And his aide said, why didn't you invite them in for a drink, like afterward? He said, well, you told me just to play tennis with them. So I did. So Carter could be so complicated and fascinating a figure because Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, when I interviewed him, he told me that Carter had essentially 3 smiles. There's the big, public, charming smile that helped get him elected that we saw a little bit here. He was not humorless at all. He really could, that big smile. Then there was that tight-lipped smile, and with these, he'd drill his icy blue eyes into you. And I experienced this a few times in our interactions. And the temperature in the room like drops by 30 degrees, right? And he's not a yeller, but you know that he is ticked off. And you're not quite sure why, and it's unnerving. And then there was the third sort of genuine smile in private, which I also was lucky enough to see sometimes. But that middle smile was frosty, and he could be cold sometimes, and that hurt him.
What are the biggest misconceptions about his presidency?
So when I asked him this question early on, he said that he was weak. And after 5 years of research, that was the conclusion that I came to also. This idea that he was somehow weak.
Yeah.
And the right wing did a good job of peddling that idea. And some of it was that he prioritized peace. So his mother, his wife, certain advisors said, why not military action against Iran? And he said, I could do that. I would be reelected, but the hostages would be executed and maybe 10,000 innocent Iranians would be killed. I'm not doing it. But it made him look weak. And he did allow himself, and I think this is a valid criticism, to almost be held hostage himself by the Ayatollah. He placed compare how often Biden talks about the American hostages in Gaza to, every part of it was the press. Walter Cronkite is saying, today the 350th day of captivity for the American hostages. And Ted Koppel starts Nightline. So it wasn't all his fault, but he did allow his presidency to be held hostage, and that made him look weak. But everything about him and the people who worked for him suggested he was a very tough customer. And in Georgia, he was called Jungle Jimmy because he was so tough. And there are a lot of other examples of that. I mean, at Camp David, we heard the Begin part. He threatened to leave. Sadat, who was a very close friend, threatened to leave, a close friend of Carter. And Carter went to his cabin at Camp David and said, Anwar, I love you. If you do this, we're cutting off all aid to Egypt, and I will make sure that you are blamed for the failure of this conference. And so Sadat said, okay, I'll stay.
I want to talk about his very eventful 44 years in the post-presidency, and we'll start with a clip of President Carter talking about the establishment of the Carter Center.
Roosevelt and I, when we left the White House, we didn't have anything else to do. And we established the Carter Center with 3 or 4 principles in mind. One is that we would not duplicate what anyone else was doing. So if the United Nations or the World Health Organization or the World Bank or the U.S. government or Harvard University was doing something adequately, we didn't get involved in it. We just decided to fill vacuums in the world. And the second thing was it would be nonpartisan in nature. And Gerald Ford was there almost every time I opened the door, and I was back with his library. And the third thing was we wouldn't be afraid to take a chance on failure if we thought the chance for things were worth. So we've gotten involved in a myriad of things that no one ever thought about doing.
So this is an incredible chapter in Jimmy Carter's life. He talked about it as being his most rewarding chapter. And this failed one-term president who fails to gain re-election goes back to Plains, Georgia in 1981, and then 21 years later finds himself to be a Nobel Peace Prize recipient. What are the milestones in Jimmy Carter's post-presidency, John?
Well, first, even though you mentioned that I thought it was marred a little bit by ego, because sometimes he became kind of a freelance Secretary of State, which would really tick off, his successors. But having said that, he revolutionized the post-presidency and set a new standard. What happened was that they were depressed after losing. Rosalind more so, but Jimmy was also depressed. His White House staff gave him a woodworking shop. He was doing that. He built all the furniture in their homes, their modest home, and then their modest cabin in North Georgia. But he wrote his memoirs, but it wasn't enough. And he woke up in the middle of the night and said, maybe we can have like a mini Camp David here. We can create a center for people to resolve disputes. He hadn't really thought through exactly what it would be. And then he did it, and it was hard raising money because he was, widely derided. He went to Trump Tower and asked Trump for money. Trump didn't give him a penny. That happened pretty often, but they were eventually able to get enough money. And unlike other presidents who played golf or went on corporate boards, when he would give a speech and he'd make some money from that, he'd give it to the Carter Center. So they got this going. People associate him with Habitat for Humanity. He didn't start Habitat for Humanity. It started in his community in Americus, Georgia, near Plains. And there's this amazing story about how it got started. And one of my great life experiences was building a house with the Carters in Memphis in 2016. And he's teaching me how to hammer, and didn't like my stroke too much. And he did the same thing to Bill Clinton when he was on the site, and then joked about it on Leno. But he put Habitat on the map, right? And their first build outside of Georgia was in New York City. And Jimmy and Rosalind Carter stayed on the bus all night. It's a former president. And then when they get to this really rundown church in New York at the entrance to the Lincoln Tunnel where they're going to stay for the night, there's a bedroom assigned to them in the vestry, and they realize there's a honeymooning couple. So they give them the bedroom, and they sleep in the bunk area, on these bunks. That was Jimmy and Rosalind Carter. And when I saw that in Atlanta, like they slept on a Murphy bed when they're in Atlanta. And they basically, it wasn't just that they built the Carter Center, it's that they went to Africa more than 40 times. And there are people in Africa who named their children after the Carters. And we heard about the disease eradication, but there were so many other things that they got involved in. And then in 1994, he prevented war in Haiti and North Korea. So there was peacemaking here as well. And the reason I try to push back against the conventional wisdom is that, when you're a former president, you just don't have as much leverage and power as when you're president, but you still can accomplish great things. And you still can be, as they were, a moral exemplar. And you still can lead by example so that everybody realizes that we can do better, whether in our community or in the country.
Let me put Carter's death in the current moment. Jimmy Carter died on the eve, figuratively, of Donald Trump regaining the White House. And I want to quote you from an article you wrote for the New York Times, where you contrast Jimmy Carter to Donald Trump. The contrast could not be starker. Trump is corrupt, chaotic, and vulgar. Carter is honest, disciplined, and respectful. Trump appeals to the worst in us, Carter to the best in us. Trump is a nationalist and an authoritarian. Carter is an internationalist and devoted to the promotion of democracy. Trump has told thousands of well-documented lies. Carter promised in his 1976 to campaign not to lie to the American people, and despite plenty of exaggerations, never did. So how do you go from Jimmy Carter getting elected in 1976 to 40 years later, the American people deciding that Donald Trump should be their president, and then deciding again to put him back in the White House 8 years later?
Well, you know, I guess I have to say that it's disillusioning. And I thought of myself, I like to think of myself for most of my journalistic career at Newsweek as JFK described himself, an idealist without illusions. And I'm still an idealist, but I realized I had more illusions than I thought I did about the good sense of the American people. And, but I think, you know, American history is not a straight line. And we've had demagogues who've been successful in the past. Fortunately, until Trump, none of them reached the White House. But, you know, Huey Long, Father Coughlin, Joe McCarthy, people have used hate and fear to win votes for a long time. So it works to a certain extent. But I, like Carter, still believe that there is this thirst for decency that has not been extinguished, and that after a rocky road ahead, we can reclaim decency and respect and civility. It is possible. We need to catch a few breaks. I think we need significant change really in both of our political parties, but especially the Republican Party. And I say that as somebody who, you know, the one politician I got too close to over the years was John McCain. Like, we're not supposed to get that close to people that we cover. So this isn't really a partisan statement. It's just a sense of that we've lost something. But when I saw those people waiting for 5 hours outside the rotunda last week, and many of them were young, it filled me with hope.
Yeah.
And I think people understand we can do better. And for Jimmy Carter's example to light our way back, I think is an inspiring thing to observe.
Let's wind down this conversation with by hearing from President Carter one more time.
What will history say about Jimmy Carter?
I think a lot of people say he only served one term. He got defeated the first time. That's not my preference. I would like for people to remember that I kept the peace and that I promoted human rights. Almost without hesitation and without too much equivocation. We had some leaders on earth that were not true Democrats, but what I explained in South America is one example. I think our human rights policy, followed up by others, helped to bring freedom. So I would say peace and human rights. That would be my preference.
John, before I ask you how Jimmy Carter should be remembered, what's your best story of Jimmy Carter, your best personal interaction with Jimmy Carter that exemplifies who he was?
There's so many that it's a little hard for me to choose, but I think some of you who watched the funeral saw Jason Carter, who is the chair of the Carter Center now, a really terrific guy with a lot of his grandfather's qualities, and he gave a terrific eulogy. And he mentioned in there his grandfather wearing short shorts and Crocs. Remember that? So in 2015, I went to Plains for, I think it was my third interview with him. And I brought my son with me, and we were scheduled to go to their house. And I got word that he had fallen into a pond and hurt his wrist, and the Secret Service had to treat him. I wasn't sure how, but I heard he may have broken his wrist. So I assumed that the interview was off, and I was told, no, go to the house. And so Rosalind wasn't there that day. He opens the door. He's wearing short shorts and Crocs, and he welcomes us in, very gracious, and he's showing my son around the house. I had already seen it. And we went into the backyard, and he hung on a clothesline his clothes that he was wearing when he fell into the pond. So I don't believe any politician is humble. I think it's like a contradiction in terms. Yeah. But the modesty and the authentic modesty of this man who believed in servant leadership really came through in almost all of our interactions. And so I think that getting to know him between 2015 and 2020 was one of the great experiences of my life.
Yeah. How should we remember Jimmy Carter?
I think that he summed it up pretty well. So we haven't talked about human rights, but he, as he acknowledged, he applied it unevenly, sometimes even a little hypocritically, because it was in the middle of the Cold War. So there were some autocrats who he maybe couldn't be as hard on as he might have in a different context. But he initiated that policy. And think about it, until Carter, no major government anywhere in the world, arguably in the history of the world, and I'm right now writing about Julius Caesar, so I'm like learning about ancient republics, ever made the way another country treated their own people central to their foreign policy. It just wasn't based on that. So Eleanor Roosevelt in 1948 wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Jimmy Carter believes, along with the Constitution, are the two most important documents in American history, and he wishes that more people knew about the Universal Declaration. But what Carter did was, having not stepped up to be part of the civil rights movement, with the help of Andrew Young and others, he took the civil rights movement global with the human rights movement. And even now, with the setbacks that we've had and more countries turning into authoritarian states, we still have many more democracies in the world than we did when Jimmy Carter was president. And I think when you combine that with the peacemaking and the advancement of human rights as a former president, his assessment of himself is the same one that I would apply.
I want to thank Barbara Smith and her colleagues from the Carter Center who are here for continuing the work of Rosalind and Jimmy Carter. And I want to thank our guest, Jonathan Alter, for being with us tonight. Jonathan, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
This was a delightful conversation.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great conversation.